Hi, community. A big welcome. Thank you so much for joining me and pressing play. My name is Kristen Skelton. I'm the founder of Bud Funding, and here we're all about helping you live your best sustainable life. And in this video, I'm going to share all about, actually, my special guest, Kathy, is going to share all about how to start an outdoor compost. And I want to give a special shout out to my brother, who has been asking me to make this video for a while. So Kathy, thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
I'm great, and thank you very much for giving an opportunity to share some knowledge and stuff with other people so we can get more people composting.
hmm So a little background about Kathy Parsons. So she's been a passionate advocate of no-dig gardening for more than 25 years and planted her first urban food forest in 2008. So let's dive right in. Kathy, are there any suggestions on the size of an outdoor compost? Any recommendations, suggestions?
Yeah, I mean, typically for really good, quick compost, you kind of want to have, the typical sort of recommendation is sort of like a meter square. But in an urban setting, that can be a lot, like trying to feed enough of that. So my answer to that kind of thing is usually it should be the size that you can easily manage and fit within your space. So smaller, it will probably take longer to compost, but it will still work. So lots of people have like the black plastic bins or whatever, and it's not necessarily ideal, but they work really well if properly managed.
Mhm.
And I mean, myself, I've had a full like meter three, sort of bin system that were meter by meter square in an urban setting, and kept all of that going too because I had the inputs to put into it. So, um, and the other thing to think about is, we'll never produce enough compost to supply our needs. So, think of other places that you could get inputs to put into your compost so that you can make the most of it.
Right. So basically, what I'm hearing is that a small compost is better than no compost at all.
Absolutely, yes. And I mean, as you get more creative and you start small and work your way up to just figure out for yourself what works.
Okay. And so, does it need to be contained? Does the compost need to be contained, or can it just be like an open pile of organics in the garden?
I've done both, and when you have lots of space, the open pile, you can make that work, but ideally it's better to contain it. You can keep it um, more, I guess, in a smaller kind of area where it's actually more actively working, because part of the volume is that it's creating the heat and all those different kinds of things to be able to actually break down the compost. So it's not going to do that as well, kind of piled out. But I mean, if you're on an acreage and have lots of space and lots of inputs, maybe an open pile makes sense. But I think for the average person, something more contained is also more aesthetic if you're in an urban setting than an open pit, and is easier to manage, and you'll actually get faster compost that way.
Okay. And what material should the compost box be made from? And so should it be covered?
You can cover them if you choose to. I've done both, and it kind of sort of depends on the year. When you have a really rainy year and it might be getting wetter than you want it to, I've thrown a chunk of plywood or something on top of it just to so I can manage the moisture in the compost bin. And then in drier years, you might want to take the extra rain. So, and again, some of it depends on aesthetics, because I mean, I've seen some pretty fancy compost systems that, I mean, they're nicely wooden, handmade kind of wooden structures that look like a fence. They're beautiful, right? And I've
Mhm.
seen all sorts of things. Probably my favorite and fastest one is just pallets. They're easy to screw together. They're about the right size. You can make them look fairly aesthetically pleasing, and obviously they're quite cheap because you can get pallets for nothing.
Mhm.
And another one that works really well is just a circle of chicken wire That works really well. Like if you're collecting leaves to make leaf mold or something like that, you can just pile them in there and there's lots of air movement, because that's the other thing. Whatever you build or whatever you use, it needs to have air. You don't want, this isn't an anaerobic process. You want to be able to get the air in there, be able to access where you can stir it, and be able to easily add, more stuff to it.
Okay. And is there a best location for an outdoor compost?
I mean, ideally, you probably want something that's, got as much sun as you can get.
Okay.
But I know in some urban settings that I've had, I wasn't going to use up, some of my precious full sun space for the compost bin. I
Right.
wanted to tuck it away somewhere. So, ideally, you want as much sun as you can, because especially in the winter on warm days like we're having now, your compost will actually start to activate again and break down more and stuff, and give you some more room to get to the actual spring. Um, and you just have to understand, if it's in a more shaded location or whatever, it just takes longer to break down.
Okay. So let's talk about materials now. What should go in the outdoor compost and what shouldn't go in the compost?
The best recommendations are things like you're gonna stay away from any kind of meat or bones, or even processed meats or any of that kind of stuff. And dairy is probably not a good idea, or anything that's
Mhm.
really oily. With compost, you want to be able to keep it kind of light and airy, because again, you want to have that airflow in it. So as you're layering in, say you got an ice cream pail of kitchen scraps or whatever, you can dump that in, and then throw uh, equivalent amount of leaves or straw, or maybe even some really fine twigs and that kind of thing, because you want to be able to um, create the air movement, the space for air to move, in order for it to properly compost, and then it won't smell.
Mhm.
Because that's when things get stinky, is usually when there's not enough airflow.
Okay. So could you put weeds in the compost?
Absolutely. Lots of people say, "Oh no, you can't do weeds." It's all about context again. um, there's a lot of weeds that are very good bioaccumulators. So something that has a really deep taproot, even like a dandelion, for example, that root is going down and not only breaking up the soil, but it's bringing minerals from down below, and it goes into its leaves as it processes them, and then the leaves die down, and that adds those back to the soil at the top level where your plants are going to be using more of it. So something like dandelion leaves would be a really good source of minerals that could go into your compost, and then you get to share that out into your garden. So um, typically, I would say whatever weeds you're putting in there, don't put the flowers in, and don't put them in there if they've gone to seed,
Okay.
because then those seeds, a really hot compost would kill off those seeds, but the average backyard composter does not get hot enough. I do usually do a hot compost in the spring,
Mhm.
where it'll be up to like 65 degrees centigrade, and break things down in like a 6 week period. But the average compost bin doesn't do that. So avoid those things. And even like dandelion flowers, if they're close to being ready to set seed, even if you've picked the whole plant and it can still feed off those leaves, those seeds will often mature in the compost bin. And I mean, I love dandelions, but I like to have them where I put them, not where,
Yeah.
you know. So, and then there's, things like chickweed and that kind of stuff. Pick them before they go to seed, and pretty much anything else, like all those things, borage, comfrey, all those things that have like big leaves and get to be big tall plants, chop those down and throw them in your compost. Rhubarb leaves, all that stuff is really good greens to go in and add those, minerals and stuff that will be important when you put it back out on the garden.
And should the organics in the compost be layered in a certain way, or should they be put in? Should what you're putting in there be put in a certain way? Any like tips or directions in terms of that?
I don't get too fussy, but I mean, the general rule of thumb is kind of a 50-50 greens browns kind of analogy. So I kind of try to stick, and I keep, volumes in my head. So if I'm putting an ice cream pail of, scraps from the last couple of days of salad making or whatever into the bin, then I'll add an equivalent amount of leaves or straw or whatever. So in the fall, I will collect a number of bags of leaves or, straw or whatever, and keep those beside the compost bin. So when I'm putting something in there, I have ready access to something in it, like a couple of really big, large, um, when they're leaf bags or whatever, will it goes quite a long way, to keep you going for the winter. And then your compost, um, it doesn't get all, like if you're just dumping in just all your veggie scraps, I mean, sure, they'll break down for absolute sure. But in the spring, you'll kind of get a smelly, slimy mess of stuff that's not that pleasant to deal with. And so I found with the layering in the winter, it helps to prevent that kind of spring stinky. And you're as soon as it gets warm enough, your compost will automatically start working better because there's airflow and all that kind of stuff within it. And so by the time you're starting to garden, at the beginning of May, it's in really good shape because it's been well managed over the winter. And
Okay.
when it's a little bit warmer and stuff, like throw an ice cream pail of water in there or snow in there or whatever to make sure you keep the moisture level up because your leaves are going to be dry or your straw is dry. And that will just help keep that balance so that it sort of keeps cooking. Um,
And so for a newbie, someone that's just starting this up, how long until the compost would begin to work?
um, it does kind of depend on how big and where it is and all those other kinds of things. Typically, what I do with my sort of passive compost system is I want to have something that's ready in the spring because I make up my own potting mix using, some compost, and some, maybe some potting soil and, other things that I add in. And so I want to have some of that readily available for when I'm potting up things, whether I'm starting seedlings and want to pot them up or I'm making planters or whatever out in the garden. Um, and so in the fall, I will take all the planters that I do have and I dump those all out and smash up the roots with a shovel to kind of break them down a little bit. Throw a ton of leaves and straw and, maybe the couple of weeks worth of kitchen scraps or whatever I have laying around, even a couple of buckets of dirt that I might not have used or whatever, and some bone meal and some kelp, and wrap that all, water it down really, really well, cover it with the tarp, and in the spring, that's ready to go back into my planters. For
Mhm.
the regular compost bin, I typically leave that over the summer, all the accumulation from winter, leave that over summer, and that's my fall compost. So I will go out into my food forest and give everybody, compost later on in the fall. So they're all ready to go in the spring. And the snow helps melt that all into the ground, and they're ready to go, and I don't have to worry about them in the spring. I can just worry about the other stuff in the yard. So
So
think
going
about it
in
kind of in a year,
okay.
you'll get usable compost.
And then going into the winter, is there specific things that you need to do to kind of prepare it for that season?
Yeah, usually like I'll clean out whatever I'm going to use for fall, and make sure that it's got a little bit of basic compost left. And then start a couple of layers. So I'll put a little bit of straw down maybe, or a pail of leaves or something, and start throwing the kitchen scraps on. Make sure that it's really, whatever's in there is really well watered going into the fall and or into the winter. And in the winter, I often do put a lid on it
Okay.
just because that helps retain any heat that it is accumulating, so it'll cook a little bit longer. And then I can manage. It's not just filling up with snow, and I can manage how much moisture or snow accumulation is on the inside, and just keep stirring it as long as you can stir it. lots of times I think with the plastic bins, you end up getting a poker, and you're kind of encouraged to do that on a fairly regular basis. Obviously, that's not going to work in the winter, but I will, kind of flip it around a few times before it freezes solid, which sometimes is November, sometimes it
Mhm.
doesn't happen till December. Kind of depends on the year and where your compost is located.
So in the summer, how often would you like flip it over with, and what do you typically use, like a shovel or what type of tool?
I try to flip it every couple of weeks. Sometimes it depends on how much I'm adding. So if I'm cleaning out the garden and I've got quite a few pails of, say, weeds or something like that, I'll kind of work the weeds in instead of just piling them all on top.
Okay.
And then I'll, kind of do layers a little bit after that. But every couple of weeks is usually enough. And the more you stir, like you don't want to stir too much because then the pile just keeps cooling down. If you actually have a hot compost where you're keeping it, up at like at 60 C or whatever, you're going to want to turn that every few days. And that's like a bigger meter by meter kind of situation. And you're trying to get the sides into the middle so that because it's the center that composts the best. So that's kind of the same idea, but probably every couple of weeks. You kind of want to, and I use a hay fork and just kind of take it from the outsides, put it
Mhm.
in there, and just kind of rotate around and keep it kind of the same size and shape, but just move where the bits are, because the outside edges won't be as broken down and the inside edges are. So helps get that air into the center of the pile. And then you can check the moisture because you want it to be wet but not soggy. And if it's dry, then you're going to start having issues like ants or wasps will move in or mice will move in. If you're having those issues in your compost, you're not keeping it damp enough.
Okay. And Kathy, are there any other learnings that you want to share with your vast experience in this area for someone new starting out?
I think the big thing is not worry about, is this right, or is this big enough, or is this, all those things. And I mean, they all are factors, but this is an experiment for you. This is something that you're just trying out. And if it isn't the ideal location or whatever, give it a shot anyway, because you just might have to manage it a little bit different and just start doing it. Like, rather than worrying about getting it right out the gate, just get it going. And you're probably going to find yourself, oh, I don't like the compost here because in the winter I have to track through drifts of snow to get to it or whatever. So, before fall, I'm going to move it over here because this is what makes sense. Or it's, too far to get the compost from the bin over to the garden or whatever. As you work things around and actually develop a flow within your own space, you're going to figure out where those things make sense. And it might change from year to year. My compost bin, I mean, I've been in this location for almost 8 years now, and I think I've had compost in 5 different locations just because that's what I needed that particular time. I did it and then, okay, now I need it over here. So nothing is permanent. And there really is, regardless of what you do or don't do, at the end of the day, you're going to end up with compost.
Right.
Right. So, whether it's particularly good compost or any of those other kinds of things, it doesn't really matter. You can refine that over time with experience, and figure out what it is that you want to use your compost for. Stuff that I'm using to start seedlings in or whatever, I'll screen that. So I just get the fine stuff out of it. The stuff that's just going in the garden, I don't bother. Like all that, all those different bigger pieces and all that kind of chunks and that kind of stuff, that's good for your garden. That is giving space for organisms. Compost isn't really fertilizer, although most people think about that. It's more about feeding and creating habitat for soil biota, which does all the other magic in your soil. So there isn't really a way to screw it up, and just spend more time observing and seeing what works for you rather than worrying about, did I get it right? You know,
Mhm.
One thing I forgot to mention about weeds was some of the things to think about. I guess it isn't just weeds, but Some things to think about when you're putting vegetables into your compost is think about vegetables that have seeds in them. So, for example, tomatoes. So, let's say you have some cherry tomatoes and some of them kind of didn't get eaten when they should have, and now you put it in your compost. Chances are those things are going to sprout. And you're going to spread your compost out, and then you're going to have a little forest of tomatoes, which might be okay by you. But it might not be okay either, because then you've got this lovely flower bed that you've, planted zinnias or I don't know, whatever in there, and now there's a tomato in the middle of it or whatever. So just think about those things that maybe might not want to do that. Another mistake people commonly make is, cleaning out a pumpkin or some other kind of squash, a spaghetti squash, and then throwing those into the compost bin, and then they've got tomato or pumpkins or spaghetti squash growing all over the place. I've had many happy accidents with that, so it's totally okay. But just be aware that what you're putting in there might grow somewhere else. Excuse me. And the thing about weeds is there's things like the roots, like say quackgrass, for example. That's not something you probably want to put into your compost bin, because it will think it has died and gone to heaven and it will just propagate everywhere. So, or something like the tubers from creeping bellflower, for example. That's something else you wouldn't want to put in there. So typically what I do with those kinds of things, they either go into my, um, you know, black bin or whatever, or I leave them out on the sidewalk and let them dry out until they're really crunchy and no chance that they'll ever live again. And then I use them as part of my browns.
Okay.
So just be conscious that some things that home compost does not get hot enough to typically kill things that seeds and those kinds of things, whether they're plants that we like tomatoes, or whether it's chickweed that we might not like.
Okay, gotcha. So what I'm hearing is the main message is just start.
Yeah,
Awesome.
exactly. And see how things go. I mean, eggshells is a good thing to add to compost. Do you want to bother breaking them up? That's up to you. You might find, you're digging around a year later, you can still see eggshells. They'll break down eventually.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
So don't sweat the small stuff. Just get it going and get a feel for it yourself and what works for you. And every year is a year to learn.
Absolutely. Kathy, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge with us. I hope this was helpful to you, community. And if you have any questions, please put them in the comment section below and I can answer them. Kathy, again, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you and your knowledge. It was great to connect with you. And I will see everyone in this community next week. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.